For this case submission, I chose to study blended learning at UCF. Before we begin, we'll discuss a brief overview. This presentation will start with the brief institutional context, followed by the need and the steps taken to address that need. We'll follow with the implementation steps and assessment measures that UCF used to gauge the effectiveness of their blended learning courses. Next, we'll cover some of the benefits that UCF identified and some of the success factors that they recognized as well. We'll conclude with some of the organizational challenges that they faced, and throughout this, I'll be giving analysis based on some of the readings and resources that we covered in class. So, to begin, we'll cover some context and background of this particular case. UCF is a large public research institution located in Orlando. By undergraduate numbers, it's the largest institution in the country. Like UCF, UF faces many of the challenges associated with large institution, mainly large numbers of undergraduates in the lower level courses. In the first part of our course, we were challenged to define what blended learning was. And blended learning, there were multiple competing definitions, which led the authors of this paper and me also to conclude that this lack of consensus really points to the fact that there is no one dominant definition of blended learning. This gap in a definition led the authors of this paper to devise their own definition of blended learning. And they set it off from traditional models that we've seen in the past. And here's an example of one of those models that we saw. And they said instead of defining blended learning by the ratio of delivery modalities that you'll see here, blended learning is more of a mindset. And that mindset is this, is simply combining the best elements, that social element of the face-to-face environment, with the technological opportunities of the online world. So what was the need that prompted this move to blended learning? In essence, it was threefold. The first was greater flexibility for students, and this involves larger enrollment classes, but just the need for greater flexibility in general. The next was improved learning outcomes in large enrollment courses. Typically, learning outcomes are lower than small enrollment courses. And finally, increased social interactions. One quote from the paper was from students who lamented the loss of that social element from their online courses. And that's really what blended learning does for online courses. It brings that social presence. If you look at this diagram on the left side of that domain, that social presence domain, and what that does is create, in my opinion, an optimal educational experience. If you look in the middle of that diagram, when the cognitive, teaching, and social presences converge, that is what I consider an optimal educational experience. What were some of the steps taken by UCF to implement their blended learning? Details of how they executed their blended learning aren't really in this paper. What we do know some things. So, for example, we know that in 1996, way back in the day, UCF started researching blended learning, and they thought it was a good thing. So they implemented blended learning, and over time, the result of that has been quite effective courses. In fact, what you'll notice when you see some of the results of their end products, that when you compare that to the multimodal model, two really prominent features of that model that stand out for me are the synthesis, evaluation, and assessment, and the social emotional areas of that. And particularly the assessment model, from the paper, it talked about the genuine assessments that students were creating as a result of blended learning. Implementation and assessment. Again, implementation, the specific details of how they executed the implementation aren't really there for this case study. Again, we know some things and we can infer some things. First of all, we know that enrollment numbers continue to grow, and that's obvious from this chart. How was the learning assessed? Or how was the effectiveness of blended learning assessed? It was assessed across multiple factors. It wasn't simply student success, although that was a huge part of it, across various ethnicities. That was also measured and assessed, but also instructor satisfaction was assessed. Let's take a look at one of the key findings here, and this is what I mentioned earlier with the student success. Um, Across semesters, across courses, blended learning courses superseded the results of even face-to-face courses as far as student success. And the benefits of blended learning are many. And I will focus on two of those and two sides of the same coin, the faculty and the student side. So the first side is the faculty side, and a quote from one of the faculty members was that this really is that when done correctly, blended learning is the best of both worlds. And that's why I included an image of Hawaii, because to me, it offers the best of both worlds, a tropical beach and snow-covered mountains. And like I mentioned earlier, instructor satisfaction was a metric that UCF used to gauge the effectiveness of their blended learning courses. And really surprisingly, 88% of instructors were satisfied with their blended learning experience. The other side of that coin were students, and students even more greatly benefited from blended learning. One of the key findings was from Figure 1, their success rates by ethnicity. And what you'll see here is that blended learning in many cases either equaled or superseded the success rates from face-to-face courses, which flies in the face of many people's thinking that face-to-face courses are really the pinnacle of a learning experience, and that hybrid courses in almost all cases take a secondary place. What were some of the success factors that UCF identified? The first was a planned and well-structured approach, and this is probably was a result of using sound instructional theory. One example of that would be using Mayer's principles for multimedia learning when designing PowerPoint or other presentations. The next was high-quality faculty development, and UF has a similar notion of this with the Faculty Institute. Course development assistants, and this comes in the form of professional instructional designers and multimedia specialists. Learner support was also important, so providing that 24/7 technical support if needed to students. And finally, ongoing formative and summative evaluations. Lastly, let's talk about some of the organizational challenges faced by UCF. And they're very similar to UF's organizational challenges. And the first of that is logistical. So what that means is you have large numbers of students, and these students are competing really for limited space in the classroom. One interesting thing that was a result of implementing blended learning at UCF was the occurrence of super sections, and these are really large sections, say 300 students, who met together online. However, their face-to-face meetings were Mondays, Wednesdays, or Fridays, making the class size more manageable. The second challenge was philosophical in nature, and it really involved three parties, students, teachers, and administrators. In essence, it really required all three parties to reevaluate their relationship to teaching and learning. This concludes my presentation, and thank you for your time and attention.